You are not failing, you are not lazy, and you are not actually behind. But it feels like you are. It feels like everyone else started moving at some invisible signal that you somehow missed. Like there was a moment when life accelerated for everyone around you, and you're still standing in the same emotional place, trying to figure out when your real momentum is supposed to begin. That feeling is more common than you think, and it has very little to do with your actual progress. Most people who feel behind are functioning. They are working, paying bills, showing up, doing what is expected. From the outside, nothing looks dramatically wrong. But internally, there's a quiet comparison running in the background. It doesn't scream. It hums. And it asks one dangerous question over and over again. Why am I not further by now? That question slowly distorts your perception of your own life. You stop measuring growth by reality and start measuring it by imagined timelines. You compare your current chapter to someone else's highlight reel, and you convince yourself that you're late. The truth is, feeling behind is rarely about time. It's about expectation. Somewhere along the way, you built a mental map of how life was supposed to unfold. By a certain age, you'd have a certain level of clarity, a certain income, a relationship that feels stable, confidence that feels permanent, direction that feels solid. And when reality doesn't match that internal blueprint, you interpret it as delay. But here's the uncomfortable part. That blueprint was never neutral. It was constructed from comparison, culture, pressure, and silent competition. You absorbed timelines from social media, from peers, from family, from the people who seemed more decisive than you, and over time, you stopped questioning whether those timelines were even aligned with who you actually are. You just assumed they were the standard. When you scroll and see engagement announcements, promotions, relocations, launches, or confident declarations about finally stepping into purpose, you don't consciously think you're falling behind. But your nervous system registers something. It registers movement. And then it scans your own life for visible markers of movement. If it doesn't find obvious ones, it interprets that as stagnation. But growth does not always look dramatic. Sometimes growth is invisible. Sometimes it looks like surviving a difficult season without collapsing. Sometimes it looks like not repeating the same destructive pattern you used to fall into automatically. That doesn't photograph well. It doesn't get announced. It doesn't trend. But it counts. Another reason you feel behind is because you confuse speed with alignment. There are people moving quickly in directions that do not suit them. They are advancing, but they are also drifting away from themselves. They look decisive, but internally they are anxious. They look confident, but they are operating from urgency rather than clarity. You don't see that part. You see the movement, and you assume movement equals certainty. But fast does not mean right, and visible does not mean stable. There is also something else happening beneath the surface, something quieter. When you feel behind, it often means you are in a transitional identity phase. You are no longer who you used to be, but you're not fully who you are becoming. And that in-between space feels like delay. It feels like pause. But it is actually recalibration. In that space, you question things you used to accept automatically. You outgrow roles that once defined you. You feel restless, not because you're failing, but because your internal standards are evolving. That evolution feels like slowness because it is internal. There is no applause for inner restructuring. And here is something most people won't admit. Sometimes feeling behind is actually fear disguised as comparison. If you truly committed to what you want, if you stopped watching others and focused only on your own direction, you would have to take responsibility for your pace. You would have to choose. Comparison allows you to delay that choice. It gives you a story. I'm behind. I'm late. I need more time. Those statements feel safer than saying, I'm afraid to commit fully, because commitment exposes you. It removes excuses. It forces movement. So instead, you stay in the mental narrative of delay. It feels passive. It feels less risky. But it also keeps you in a loop. Another layer of this is the illusion of linear progress. You assume growth should be steady and upward, that every year should look objectively better than the last, more stable, more impressive, more defined. But human development is not linear. It moves in waves. There are years of expansion and years of consolidation. There are seasons where everything accelerates, and seasons where you quietly build internal strength without visible reward. If you judge a consolidation season by expansion standards, you will always feel behind. You are not meant to sprint through every phase of your life. Some seasons are designed for integration, for understanding, for dismantling what no longer fits. And dismantling looks slow from the outside. You might also be underestimating how much you have actually changed. Because growth that happens gradually doesn't feel dramatic. You don't wake up one day transformed. You wake up slightly more aware than yesterday, slightly less reactive, slightly clearer. Over time, those small shifts accumulate. But your mind doesn't track subtle progress well. It tracks milestones, events, external validation. If your growth has been mostly internal, it feels invisible. And invisible growth feels like no growth. That is where the distortion begins. There is also a psychological trap tied to potential. If you were once labeled as talented, intelligent, capable, or going far, you may carry a silent pressure to constantly prove that early promise. And if your current life doesn't look exceptional, you interpret it as underachievement. But potential is not a race. It unfolds differently, depending on the depth of your self-understanding. And sometimes the people who start slower build foundations that last longer. When you feel behind, ask yourself something more honest. Behind who? Behind what timeline? Behind whose definition of success? Most of the time, the answer is vague. It's not one specific person. It's a collective pressure. A cultural momentum that says you should be more certain, more visible, more accomplished by now. But certainty is not the same as clarity. And visibility is not the same as fulfillment. You might be slower because you are more reflective. You might be cautious because you are more aware of consequences. You might be exploring because you refuse to settle prematurely. Those are not weaknesses. They are traits that often lead to deeper alignment. There is also a biological element to this feeling. Your nervous system compares constantly. It scans for status, position, belonging. That mechanism once helped humans survive in groups. Today, it gets hijacked by constant exposure to curated lives. You are not comparing yourself to 10 people in your immediate environment. You are comparing yourself to hundreds of filtered trajectories daily. Your brain was not designed for that scale of comparison. So it interprets normal life as insufficient. But here is the shift. What if you are not behind, but early in a phase that has not yet become visible? What if this is the quiet build-up before a directional pivot? What if the discomfort you feel is not evidence of delay, but evidence that your current situation no longer satisfies you? That dissatisfaction is not proof of failure. It is proof of growth pressure. Growth pressure feels uncomfortable because it demands change. And change requires clarity. Instead of asking why you're behind, ask where you are actually resisting movement. Not movement in comparison to others, but movement in alignment with yourself. Is there a conversation you've been postponing? A skill you know you should be developing? A direction you're curious about, but haven't allowed yourself to explore seriously? Sometimes the feeling of being behind is just the emotional cost of postponed decisions. You don't feel late because time ran out. You feel late because you know something inside you has been waiting for action. And that action doesn't have to be dramatic. It can start small. Reclaim your definition of progress. Write it down. Define what growth looks like for you. Not for the algorithm, not for your peers, not for your family. Then measure against that. You may discover that you are not behind at all. You are simply on a different trajectory. There will always be someone ahead of you in one category. There will always be someone younger with more visible success. That comparison never ends. But alignment is personal. The person who feels ahead externally might feel internally lost. The person who looks behind externally might be building something durable. You do not see the full picture of anyone else's life. You only see the chapter they choose to display. And most displayed chapters are edited. If you feel behind, slow the comparison cycle. Reduce exposure to curated timelines. Redirect that energy into skill, clarity, and execution. Feeling behind is not a life sentence. It is a signal. It tells you that your internal standards have shifted and your external reality has not caught up yet. That gap can create anxiety, or it can create direction. The difference depends on whether you use the feeling to criticize yourself or to recalibrate yourself. You are not late. You are in process. And process rarely feels impressive while it is happening. But one day, when the structure you're building internally becomes visible externally, it will look sudden to everyone else. They will call it momentum. They will call it luck. They will say it happened quickly. And you will know it didn't. It was built in the quiet seasons when you thought you were behind. So stop measuring your life by noise. Measure it by alignment. Measure it by courage. Measure it by whether you are moving closer to who you actually are. Because the only real way to be behind in life is to never begin, and you have already begun.